All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Financial Friday session where we're going to discuss how to compare the costs of living on versus off campus. So, my name is Lindsay Bertram, and I manage the Financial Wellness at Penn program. Before we dive in, let me tell you a little bit about our program. So, Financial Wellness at Penn is a program that teaches students about personal finances. You can read our full mission statement on the slide. I also want to acknowledge that while our program offers personal finance education, we don't assume that financial education can solve all financial problems. We cannot erase the impacts of generational poverty or financial discrimination. I was once a low income student at Penn and I budgeted on a weekly basis, and it didn't make me less poor or make me have more money. Instead, it allowed me to find ways to manage my money in the best way that I could. So, our goal is to empower you to take ownership of your finances with whatever means you have. So, disclaimers aside, let's move on to today's topic, which is the costs of moving off campus. We do like to start all of our workshops by outlining the goals that we hope to accomplish during our time together. So today we hope to help you understand the differences between the on and off campus cost of attendance, identify the unique financial considerations of living off campus, and identify some key lifestyle differences between on and off campus living. So let's dive in. And I encourage you, if you have questions, you can send them throughout the presentation. And depending on what they are, we can address them in the moment or I'll save them for the end. So I want to start today by explaining the undergraduate cost of attendance and why understanding that will help you figure out if moving off campus is a good financial choice for you. I do want to give a quick disclaimer to say that the next 2 to 3 slides are going to be most relevant for undergraduate students. So if there are graduate students in attendance, I'd recommend you just stick around to hear the later parts of today's workshop. So let's start with the cost of attendance. So your cost of attendance, or COA, I might refer to it as, it is an estimate of all the educational costs that you'll incur in the academic year. And this includes both direct and indirect costs. So direct costs are those that are billed by the university. They have standard, finite amounts that are announced on an annual basis. Indirect costs, on the other hand, are those that are not billed by the university. So basically, Penn gives an estimate of how much you might expect to spend in that category. And we'll talk a little bit more about how financial aid fits into that in a bit. So let's go ahead and look at this year's cost of attendance as an example. And I want to acknowledge that this year, the undergraduate cost of attendance is a little wonky because of the pandemic and the differences in how the spring and fall semesters are organized. So just keep in mind some of these numbers may look strange, but nonetheless, the theory behind this is all the same. So this is a screenshot pulled from the Student Registration Financial Services website. You can see the expenses included in the cost of attendance in the leftmost column. So this is all of the different sort of line items that might be included in your cost of attendance. And then these are followed by the allowances for those expenses in the following columns for on campus in the middle column, and then off campus for the rightmost column. And I chose to omit this year's third cost of attendance, which is the living at home, for the sake of today's presentation, just because that's a really unique circumstance for this year in particular. So when you take a look at this table, you'll notice that some costs are different between the two columns and some are the same. Additionally, some have asterisks and others do not. The numbers with asterisks are direct expenses, meaning, like we just talked about, they are charged to your student account directly. And again, the indirect expenses are estimates of how much you might expect to spend based on averages, I'm not going to go into depth on how these numbers are determined, partially because I'm not involved in those determinations, so it's not really up to me, but you should know that a lot of institutional effort is put into determining if these numbers accurately reflect student costs. That way we can make sure we're providing the right amount of funding to students. So since we're talking about off-campus living today, take a look at the housing and dining categories and how they differ for on and off-campus costs of attendance. So if you look at housing and just look at the total amount, not the fall and spring distribution, you can see that the allowance for housing for on-campus is $9,827. It is slightly less than that for off-campus. It's $9,632. You can also see within dining, the costs are different as well. So I point this out because you'll see in both of those cases that there's no asterisk on housing and dining in the off-campus column. And this means that the university still anticipates that you'll need to have housing and dining to succeed as a student, which is why they are included in the cost of attendance. But those charges won't be billed to your account. Those are estimates of how much you personally might expect to spend, depending on the choices you make. And we'll talk more about this. So let's talk about financial aid to understand why that matters. So the basis of every financial aid package that a student receives is the financial aid application submitted by the student every year. So you have to fill out the same forms every year. You have the FAFSA, the CSS profile. At Penn, we also have the Penn Financial Aid Supplement, or PFAS. You may also have to submit W-2s or tax return statements, etc. The information that is submitted by you and your family determines how much your family can reasonably contribute toward your education. And this is called the expected family contribution, or EFC. I may call it that throughout the presentation. The EFC is just an amount. It doesn't indicate what specific line items that you're meant to contribute to. It's simply how much you're expected to contribute in total to your entire cost of attendance. This is also broken down further into the parental and student contributions. For the sake of today's presentation, those distinctions don't matter all that much, but that's basically how much the student themselves is expected to pay versus how much their family is expected to pay. And these amounts are completely determined by the information you submit. They do not change based on what's charged to your account. And I want to highlight that because I think at least a common myth that I heard from my peers when I was a student was, they thought if my expected family contribution is about the same amount as housing, like the housing allowance, then that means if I move off campus, I just don't have to pay that anymore. And that's not true. The EFC is a standard amount and doesn't specify what specifically it's going to. So just keep that in mind. And if that's confusing, feel free to send questions in the chat and I'm happy to clarify that as much as I can. So once your EFC is determined, the demonstrated financial need can be determined with a simple formula. And this is on the screen right here. So I'm going to go back to the previous slide just to show the numbers. So the total cost of attendance, so where it says total budget at the bottom here, that amount minus whatever your expected family contribution is, that's the demonstrated financial need. Okay, so someone sent me a message asking, are we paying the EFC to the school or is that just for us? So truly it depends. And the reason why is because the question of indirect expenses again. So let me get through the rest of the slide and I'll see if that clarifies your question. And then if not, send me another message and I will clarify further. So again, once the EFC is determined, the demonstrated financial need can be then determined with a simple formula. So again, total cost of attendance minus the expected family contribution is the student's demonstrated financial need. Additionally, Penn has grant-based financial aid. So what this means is that they meet 100% of demonstrated need with grant funding. So basically, Penn is saying by attending our institution, you are expected to incur this much in expenses in order to successfully complete your education, AKA this is your cost of attendance. Your family is responsible for this portion over here, AKA your expected family contribution, but we've got the rest of it with grants. Now, in some cases, if a student has a low expected family contribution, they may receive grant funding that exceeds the costs billed to their account. And because both charges and aid are applied to your account, they balance out to some lump sum that you either owe or you receive as a refund. So if you have a positive balance in your account on PenPay, you owe some amount of money. If you have a negative balance, you can expect some refund to be given to you. And again, going back to this idea that they are applied as sort of lump sums, and that's what you see, there's nothing to tell you what that money is for. So to the question that was sent to me, basically, the answer is it depends, because if your EFC is high enough that it covers all of your indirect expenses plus a little bit of your direct expenses, or maybe all, depending on your circumstances, that would mean that you are contributing something to Penn because you have some sort of bill. However, if your EFC is relatively low and it's less than the total amount of your indirect expenses, you're going to end up with more grant funding on your bill, and that's going to result in a refund instead. Let me know if that answers your question or not, because if you have anything specific that's unclear there, I'm happy to elaborate. Okay, well, I'll just give it a minute. Let me know if you have more questions throughout the presentation, and I'm happy to return to this concept, because this is sort of the main thing to understand if you're considering on versus off campus. So the follow-up question says, for those with low EFCs, can we just disregard that cost since grants cover it? If you mean like that cost in terms of your EFC, grants don't cover it per se, because that's an amount you're expected to contribute. But contribution doesn't necessarily mean it's going to Penn. So if we go back to this, I think some of the most tangible examples are things like books and supplies or personal expenses. Your expected family contribution is how much you're expected to pay toward your educational costs in total. So, if books and supplies plus personal expenses comes out to, like, I'm just going to round up to 3,500. If your EFC is less than 3,500, and we're going to ignore these other expenses for a moment, if your EFC is less than that, then yes, you would receive grant funding to cover the remaining costs, but you're still responsible for whatever your EFC is. But again, because these are not billed directly, you may not actually spend this much money. So to use a personal example, when I was a student, I studied psychology. Once you get past intro level courses, for the most part, you don't have textbooks anymore and you're just reading journal articles. So past my sophomore year, I really didn't have any textbook costs. Like that just wasn't an expense I was incurring. Or, depending on choices you make, you might spend less on transportation than what's allotted here. You might spend less on personal expenses than what's allotted. So depending on like the specific amount and how your student account balances out, you may not need that full amount to contribute toward your education. And that can feel a little confusing. And again, I'm happy to talk more about this from personal experience, but I'm going to go ahead and move on. And if okay, I got it. That makes sense. I'm so glad that makes sense. That's really great to hear. Okay, so going back to this idea. So again, we've talked a lot about EFC and sort of how that plays out. So again, in some cases, if a student has a low expected family contribution, they may receive grant funding that exceeds the cost billed to their account. And this could trigger some sort of refund. So hopefully that sort of explains also, like if you're a low income student and you already live off campus and you're wondering how you end up with that money to live off campus, there's not some person deciding whether or not you get this money or not. It's totally based on the numbers that you've submitted and a simple formula used for every single student. So anyway, all this financial aid mumbo jumbo is to say that it's incredibly likely, unless your family has experienced like a huge increase in income, that if your on-campus housing is currently covered by financial aid, your off-campus housing will also likely be covered by financial aid. Again, if you have more specific questions, you can send them in the chat. I also highly recommend, if you're ever unsure of how this is going to balance out, talk to your financial aid counselor, a financial aid counselor. They can help you sort of estimate what might come in the future. I will say, if you're like talking about these things at this point in the year, just keep in mind that any numbers discussed for the next school year are simply estimates because the cost of attendance has not yet been determined. So you may not have exact numbers, which can make it kind of hard to plan for. But again, for the most part, if your family like financial circumstances stay about the same, you can expect similar aid from year to year. So you need to know these things in advance because you need to know what resources you'll have to support you in paying rent and other associated costs. And this is where budgeting comes in. If you're looking for off-campus housing, you're going to have to estimate income to know how much you can reasonably pay for rent. So how do you actually do that? First, I want to make it clear that experts recommend keeping housing costs, and these include renter's insurance and utilities. They recommend keeping these under 30% of your take-home pay. So what you should do is calculate your estimated monthly income. If you have a work study job or another like hourly paid job, you'll want to calculate how much you make in a month. And basically what you'll do, this may seem like common sense, but I'm going to talk you through it anyway. You want to take your hourly wage, multiply it by how many hours you tend to work in a week, multiply that by 4 weeks so that you get your monthly income. And then don't forget to estimate taxes. And be as conservative as possible with this because taxes can fluctuate depending on a variety of factors. In general, as a student, you're probably safe in assuming that about 25% of your paycheck will be removed for taxes. Again, this fluctuates. Sometimes it could be more, sometimes it could be less. You can take a look at past paychecks to get a more reasonable estimate of how much in taxes is taken out on a regular basis. Keep in mind that the amount that's taken out depends on whether you're currently in classes or not. So for instance, if you've ever worked at Penn in the summer, you may have noticed you're taxed a little bit more, and that has to do with like federal tax guidelines that I'm not going to get into. But anyway, you want to be as conservative as possible when you're estimating these taxes because you basically want to assume you'll have the least amount of money that's possible for you to have. That way you're not in a situation where you've overestimated how much you can possibly pay. And if less is taken out in taxes, that's great. You have more money than you thought you would. That can really only be beneficial and help you out from time to time. Now, going back to this conversation about financial aid, if you have additional income, like a stipend, if you're a grad student, or a student account refund, whether that's from grant or loan funding, you can estimate how much that amount that you'll receive will be and divide it among the months that it's supposed to cover. In most cases, students receive those types of funding at the start of each semester, so you'll probably want to divide it among 4 months to know how much you have. If you're receiving money at different intervals than that, you'll want to accommodate for whatever period of time it's covering instead of that 4-month estimate. Once you calculate all of the income that you have available to you within a specific month, you can calculate basically how much is reasonable for you to pay in rent plus renter's insurance and utilities, like I mentioned before. And I've included the formula on the slide. So you want to multiply your monthly income post-tax. Again, I want to highlight how important that is. You're going to multiply that income by 0.3, and that's going to get you 30% of monthly income. That's the maximum amount your housing costs should be. Now, as a student, you may not have that much income, so that amount may seem small. No matter how small it is, you should look for an apartment that can accommodate that maximum housing cost. And if you find it hard to do that, you can look for roommates. You can look for apartments that are farther away from campus. You know, I won't say most, but many apartments or houses that are close to campus tend to be pricier because students can pay for the luxury of having closer proximity to campus. And we'll talk a little bit about proximity as a factor later on. But if you're looking for lower costs, you probably want to go a little farther away from campus. But my main message is know your limits and look for ways to keep your costs within those limits. Don't overdo it. And I'm not just saying this for your own benefit so that you're not burdened by your rent costs. I'm saying this because it's also a factor in whether or not you'll be approved for a lease at all. So your new potential landlord is going to want to know how stable you will be in paying your monthly responsibilities. They want to make sure there's no liability there and that they won't lose money. And your income is not the only factor that's considered in deciding whether or not you're a qualified tenant, I guess. Your credit score may also be reviewed. If you have not yet started building credit, you should consider doing that if you want to rent an apartment in the near future, whether that's during your time at Penn or after you graduate and maybe you'll move to a new city when you start a new job. Your credit score is another tool that's used to determine if you can be trusted to pay rent. So again, if you haven't started building credit yet, you may not be totally on your own. Most apartments allow for cosigners, and a cosigner is a person who also signs the lease and basically is also legally responsible for rent to be paid on time. Typically, you would want to ask some adult in your life that you're close to and you trust. You'll also need to prove to them that they can trust you to pay rent so that they don't fall into a position where they become responsible for your expenses. You'll want to show them that you can follow through on your responsibilities because again, if you don't, then that responsibility it falls on them to pay those. And you know, not that we think this happens often, but if something goes wrong and you are affected negatively, it won't just be your credit that's affected, but also your cosigners. So there's a lot of trust involved here. And many students need cosigners. And the reason why is because you're so young, it takes time to build credit. And so having a cosigner is really typical. Even after I graduated and had established credit for a few years, I still needed a cosigner. It's way more normal than you think it is, even though it feels like for some reason people don't talk about it. But yeah, if you want to learn more about how to build credit or have questions about that, you can send questions here. I don't want to make today's presentation about credit, but we would love to help you explore your options if you're confused about how to move forward on that front. So aside from the monthly responsibilities that come with renting your own apartment or house, there are some upfront costs that you should be prepared for. And I want to be clear that these expenses come up anytime you rent a place to live. It's not specific to living off campus as a student. These costs exist at every single stage in life. Anytime you rent a new place, you will experience this. And these expenses, these upfront costs include all the things listed on the screen. So application fees. To even be considered as a potential tenant, you'll need to submit an application, and it will cost money to submit this application. And that's for a few reasons. They'll do a credit check, and that typically costs them some money. So Obviously, this company is not going to want to put out a ton of money to consider many tenants when they're only going to end up with one. So that's one of the reasons why there are application fees. It can range anywhere from like $30 to $40 to even more, maybe $100. This completely depends on property management and how much they choose to charge. But as you're considering how much it will cost to rent an apartment, you should factor that in to the amount that you'll need to have up front. If you are then approved for the apartment, you'll need to pay a pretty big chunk of money up front. So this typically includes first and last month's rent and a security deposit. And generally the purpose of this money is to communicate that you're committed to the terms of the lease and that you'll do your best to uphold the state of the apartment unless you want to lose some of that money. So first and last month's rent, shows that you're going to stay in that apartment for the duration of the lease. Security deposit is if you damage the property in any way, at the end of your lease, you'll receive your security deposit back. But if they have to pay anything to fix damages that were caused by you or roommates, that may be removed from your security deposit. And your property management may also provide you a list of what specific things they're looking for when they assess what to take out of your security deposit. So you can always look at that to sort of set ground rules for how you manage the apartment. But yeah, these costs are accountability measures. And the amount for this can vary. Obviously, first and last month's rent is going to be exactly what it says. So multiply your rent by 2. In some cases, apartments may only require first month's rent, not both. You'll want to find out what specifically they're looking for. Security deposits can range in cost. I think most often I've seen them as, again, 1 month's rent. But sometimes they're just flat amounts like $500 or $1,000 or whatever it may be. You should know upfront how much they're expecting. And you can ask that question if they're not being forthcoming with the information. My recommendation is that if you ever plan to move into an apartment, you should have about 3 months of rent saved up first, just in case, because that's likely going to be the maximum that they ask for upfront. And it's never bad to save even more. And again, that's because you have all these upfront costs. So the next thing you'll want to plan for is renter's insurance. This can be an upfront cost or a monthly cost, depending on your plan. For me personally, it was an upfront cost. I paid an annual fee for renter's insurance when I first got an apartment. And if you're wondering whether you need this or not, I cannot emphasize enough how much this is crucial. Like full stop, if you're going to live off campus, you need renter's insurance. I know that you all know why insurance is of any kind is important. It's to protect yourself in the case of an emergency. And obviously none of us like to think we will experience emergencies, but God forbid something happen and you lose some of your belongings, you're going to want that protection. Renter's insurance can help you with that. So again, cost and frequency of payment will depend on your specific plan and what you're looking for. It's typically not too much money. But yeah, you'll want to factor that into your plans. And then you will also want to furnish your apartment. I feel like this is a step that people forget about. It's like most of the battle is just finding the place to live. And you forget you actually need, a place to sleep, a place to sit, whatever it may be. And this can be pretty costly depending on where you get the items, especially if you buy all brand new stuff. It's going to cost quite a lot no matter where you shop. It's really expensive to furnish a home. So I'm going to share just a few tips. You can always buy used. You can look at thrift stores. You can look at free and for sale groups on Facebook, or look at Craigslist if that's something you're comfortable with. If your family is relatively local, you could consider moving furniture from your home if that's an option. I know this is not the case for most students, but my point is I encourage you to be as creative as possible when identifying resources available to you to furnish your home. Additionally, you can buy items over time, pay for the necessities upfront, and then make a plan. Figure out what do you absolutely need in your first few weeks or months in this new home, and you can add additional things over time. You don't have to do it all at once. So don't discount that option. And in the case that you rent a furnished apartment or are subletting, this might not matter. However, it's something to know for future renting experiences as well. You are likely going to experience this at some point. Lastly, you may be responsible for some utilities in your new apartment. This could include Wi Fi or electricity, water, trash, gas, etc. Not only do these add monthly costs to your budget, because you'll likely pay for these things on a monthly basis, but there may also be some upfront setup fees. I can't really give you estimates for how much that'll be because it's going to depend, one, on which utilities you're responsible for within your lease, but then also the provider that you choose for those. You can always call them in advance to get an estimate of what costs should be expected when setting something up. But just keep that in mind, know which utilities you're responsible for, and make a plan to be able to switch those over into your name once you're in your new home. And since today's conversation is about preparing for these expenses, I want to again return to this conversation about financial aid, and the role of financial aid in managing these upfront costs. In many cases, in fact, in most cases, students are applying for apartments months in advance, sometimes up to a year in advance, depending on where you're looking and demand, and if your friends are pressuring you to commit to on campus or off campus at a specific time. I want to be clear that there is no way to receive financial aid for the following year's apartment. So if you're considering living off campus next year, there's no way to receive money for that right now. So this is something that you're going to have to save for, and make possible for yourself. And it's likely going to require budgeting of some sort. This is why saving is so important. If you're not sure if you'll ever live off campus while you're a student, you may still want to start saving for when you live on your own after you graduate. To be completely transparent, when I started renting an apartment after I graduated, I had planned and estimated income and, estimated what costs I was going to have. And I still ended up in a position where I was in a really tight spot and I didn't quite have the resources I needed. I got really lucky, that I won a few awards at the end of my senior year and I received some money from that. And truly, that is how I paid rent for the first few months. Like, that's how I covered my expenses. Furnishing an apartment is another one of those things that, that's the money that I used to do that. So learn from my mistakes. I ended up okay, but I think it's really important to try to plan as much as you can in advance, because you never really know how much you're going to need. So, moral of the story is always save. Save as much as you can. And yeah, even subletting often requires some of these upfront costs. So just be prepared. And if you ever want to walk through your expected future costs one-on-one, we can do that as well. So the last thing I want to discuss today is the fact that, the choice of living off campus versus on campus is not just about money. It is also based on convenience. So I'm just going to talk through a few specific factors that can be easy to forget about. And I will be forthcoming that both on-campus and off-campus living have their pros and cons. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's entirely personal. No one can decide what's right for you other than you. So one factor is proximity to campus. So this may not seem relevant right now, since classes are not happening in person, but at some point, you will all return to in-person classes, and proximity to campus will be of great importance when deciding where to live. And if you don't think it matters that much, just think about the worst case scenarios. Think about, it's a late January night, so it's super cold. You've been studying really late in the engineering quad, and now, you're walking home to your apartment at 45th Street. And all of a sudden, you have these 11 blocks to walk in the dark when it's super cold, in below freezing temperatures. It's not fun. So, if that's something you're up for, by all means go for it, but just know that that's what you're getting yourself into. There are also services to help with that. Penn Rides on Request can be a great service to help you get to and from campus when you need. Just definitely pay attention to where they actually go. And it is free if you have a Penn card. And if you have questions about Penn Rides on Request, I can tell you about my experience using it. Either way, think about how often you might like to return home during a typical day. What distance from campus is going to allow you to maintain those habits? So another one is cooking at home. And I will say that this is not entirely unique to off-campus living, but by virtue of moving off campus, you may become much more responsible for your own meals. You won't have the luxury of free meals in your college house. You may have to be more intentional about how you plan your meals in advance, because now you have a slightly longer commute to campus. You need to factor that into your schedule. You may not be able to run home midday to grab a snack or something. You'll need to plan for your meals and be really thorough. And we did host a workshop in September about grocery shopping on a budget. That doesn't necessarily cover sort of how to plan for meals midday, but there's a recording of that workshop on our website if you'd like to review it. And if you look at that and you want to talk one-on-one about how to plan for those types of things, we can do that as well. The last thing I want to talk about as a factor is maintenance responsibilities. These may also be new. So upkeep to some extent may become a responsibility of yours. So when you live on campus, maintenance tends to be pretty straightforward. You call or submit a request online. Someone comes in the next 1 to 2 days, depending on the nature of the thing you need to have repaired. And it's taken care of, done. Like, you can just wipe your hands clean of it. Don't have to think about it anymore. When you live off campus, depending on your landlord, some of the responsibility might fall on you. Depending on your landlord, it could be incredibly easy or difficult to get help with household issues. So do some research into the responsiveness of any property management company you're considering. You could talk to people who currently live there or have lived there before. It's really important to know that you'll be supported. Finding an apartment is not just about the place you end up living in, but also, to what extent are they going to be useful to you? Someone asked if we can drop the link to the website in the chat when this is over. Yes, and actually, I'm going to sort of diffuse responsibility here and ask one of our student ambassadors who is in this call to find that link. Lawrence, if you could do that, that would be great. So the bottom line to this entire conversation is the choice between living on campus and off campus. I'll just send it in the chat, the link to our website. Okay, so the bottom line is that the choice between living on campus and off campus is entirely personal. So when I was a student, to me, the most important factor was the convenience of living on campus. It was way, way, way easier for me to stay on campus than to try to manage living off campus. I was also a highly aided student, so housing costs were covered for me. I didn't need to worry about it at all. I was not concerned about saving money by trying to find a cheap apartment off campus. So, what was right for me when I was a student and what's right for your peers now may not be what's right for you, and that's okay. You should identify your priorities, figure out the costs for you personally of both options, and also think about some of the other factors that we talked about on this last slide. Find the choice that best aligns with those priorities. And we're always here to talk to you and help you make a plan as well if you're not sure. So just keep that in mind. So that's really it from us today. Thank you again for joining us. And if you have questions, please send them in the chat and we'll answer them. Thank you, Lawrence, for pulling the link to our website. So if you visit our website and you're looking for the recordings of past workshops, you can scroll down and find, there should be a tab that says Financial Wellness Workshops, and that'll list all of the workshops we've hosted this semester with links to the recordings on YouTube. So yeah, if you have questions, please send them in the chat. If you want to talk one-on-one, our contact information is at the bottom of this slide, so you can email us directly. You can reach out to us on Facebook or Instagram. Additionally, please fill out the evaluation form that's linked on the screen. You can use the QR code or short link to access the form. We really, really value your feedback, and it's crucial for us to adapt these presentations for future audiences. So please take a moment just to tell us what you thought. We'd really appreciate it. So yeah, please stay connected with us. If you have questions, I'll linger for a minute or so to answer them. But yeah, thanks again for coming.